it's strange to pretend that this is a lecture because I've been in every single summer school since the year 2002 or something like that. And one, I guess, just goes in there and says whatever and has an engagement with the students. But this is a prepared presentation. I thought there was a lot of ground to cover, so I've put down things in a PowerPoint, 2 PowerPoints actually. And because I know that also the students who come here are from many, many different kinds of places, intellectually and geographically, and they might not always be familiar with some of the trajectories of Indonesia cultural studies. So, but you've been here a week and you listen to Andy Van. I'm sure you listen to other people speaking about the legacy of Indonesia cultural studies. So my task would probably be a little bit easier. So what I want to focus on is some of the epistemological challenges. Like if you want to produce knowledge in the Indonesia context, what are the kinds of challenges that you might face? And what are the challenges the network has faced? I've been part of the network since 1998, which is when it began. And our first meeting was actually in Manila. So it's a very nice form of return, if you like. So the main epistemological challenge that the IACS network faces, and I'll say much more about this as we go along, is how do we overcome various kinds of methodological nationalisms. This is a methodological nationalism is a term coined. We always knew what it was, but the actual term was coined in 2002 by 2 European writers, Wimmer and Schiller. We can find the reference if you are interested in looking it up. It's a very useful way of dealing with how knowledge gets formed in the social sciences and humanities. So I'm going to address the following questions in my talk. My main concern will be how do we reimagine research for the post-pandemic present? What does it mean to think about interconnections in Asia that don't fall into colonial frameworks or into Cold War geopolitics? And therefore, how do we articulate new axes of connection? So my question is then how do we articulate new axes of connection? And the 2 projects that I've been working on currently and in the recent past will exemplify some of these ways of articulating the new axes of connection. And I also would like to propose that we need new kinds of flexible research to develop forms of knowledge relevant to the 21st century. And to understand, as you have been glimpsing through your short stay in the Philippines, what are the forms of life that are being shaped in this region? I think Andy had asked you all to read my introduction to genealogies of the Asian present. I don't know if you've actually read it, but presuming you have, let's put it behind you and you can take a look at it. This is a reader that I brought out some years ago along with Wang Xiaoming of Shanghai University. And in that, we explore the question of the IACS imagination, the question of Indonesia methodology, which I speak about at some length in that introduction. And one of the propositions that I put forward in the first journal issue of Indonesia Cultural Studies in the year 2000 was a question of alternative frameworks of comparison. And what I meant by that, just to give you in a nutshell what the argument was, that all research, especially in the non-Western world, is comparative by nature. And the comparative research often has an invisible pole. So if you're in the Philippines or if you're in India, where I'm from, you say India and the West, Philippines and America, not the West, right? So this is the way you talk about the other space that you're comparing your own space to. And I had argued at the beginning of the project of Indonesia Cultural Studies that we need to create other frameworks of reference, that we need to think about what it might mean to make visible this invisible pole of comparison, to name it as such and to maybe dislodge it a little bit, and to see what it might mean to compare across the global south, if you like, without having to pass through the metropolis. This was an ambition. We don't know how successful we have been, but at least to mark it as a space of engagement, I think is extremely important. So this has been happening to some extent in our network over the last 25 years. What has been easy is to bring in the elements of the landscape, the geopolitics of our own location, and to talk about that sometimes in terms of sub-regions, like you can talk about, say, Korea and Japan, or you can talk about China and Taiwan, you can talk about Hong Kong and Singapore. or whatever. But in terms of actually doing research that cuts across these locations, that has been much harder because of the kind of resources that it requires. I've been very fortunate in being able to undertake some of that kind of research, and I'll speak about that and to speak about the possibilities. So in order to do that new kind of inter-Asia research, I suggest that it might mean that we go beyond the post-colonial proposition, and myself and scholars of my generation in the 90s in particular were the ones who spoke about post-colonialism and post-colonial studies. But the proposition that we made was still confining us within the nation state. So we were looking at India, looking at the Philippines, looking at Malaysia, whatever. And it does get, like I said, in order to conceptualize a post-colonial present that is anti-colonial, we end up positing a nation state. Yeah, so that I think was a problem. And I suggest that we need to go beyond that. And I also suggest that something that is very trendy these days, or has been for some time, the decolonial proposition. I find that also deeply problematic because it suggests to my mind that a return to ahistorical forms of pre-colonial forms of knowledge, or it suggests a scrubbing clean of the effects of colonialism, which I think cannot be done. So what I propose to you is that in inter-Asia, we cannot be post-colonial and we cannot be decolonial, but we need to try and get beyond these conceptual propositions. I think instead of only continuing on the conceptual plane, I will just jump into the projects which I think you might find interesting and discuss how research that goes beyond post-coloniality and decoloniality might work. So the first project is on music and the second on digitality. This one is an example of practice-based cultural research. And the second one, which I'll speak about later, is an example of multi-sited ethnographic research. So in practice-based research, I think some of you will be familiar with this idea that in order to explore the research question, you don't do the standard, I do the literature review and then I will find my research questions and then I will deal with my research problem. Instead, in order to explore the questions that you might have, the researcher needs to actually make something. Yeah? And the research is embodied in a creative practice. So this is what I did in the SATSAT project. We ended up at the end of 6 years, we produced a double-sided music album, which was nominated for the Grammy Awards, and we produced a film. So there are many tracks. I will play you one or two of them, and I will try to explain how this project came together. So thinking about cultural practice in relation to journeys involving music, migration, and modernity have been central to my own work for at least 2 decades. I looked at African-Asian crossings in the Caribbean, I looked at Hindustani music in Mumbai, and Indian-Chinese musical crossings. These have been my 3 major areas of interest. And these musical journeys traverse issues of nationhood and subject formation as they take shape in the global south. So my interest has been in tracing these journeys and tracing through these journeys the arcs of connection and disconnection, and sometimes reconnection. My questions had also to do with the role of cultural practice, here music, in repurposing the past for present-day use. So you have many dimensions here. You're looking at the past, you're looking at how, especially in a cultural form like music, you repurpose the past in order that it might speak to present-day conditions and circumstances. So my question in this project was, what happens when Indian and Chinese musicians meet? When you say Indian and Chinese, of course, it's really hard to not refer to nation states, but I was trying very hard, trying my best not to refer to nation states, but instead refer to practices that are performative idioms, embedded in specific social, cultural, and political histories. So were the musicians able to overcome the lack of shared languages? Because the Indians, did not know any either Mandarin or Cantonese, which are the 2 languages we dealt with, and the Chinese musicians did not know any Indian languages. Music, especially vocal music, is heavily dependent on the sung word. So how did you overcome that particular question is what we are going to be talking about. So can the musicians then communicate through a lingua musica? This is a term that I've coined in my other work on Mumbai. And this lingua musica comprises voice and melody. and if not the spoken word, and if they are communicating through a lingua musica, what are they communicating? Yeah? Do they simply perform their own music side by side with each other, as happens in a lot of fusion music, or are they actually creating a new kind of music? I will let you be the judge. I will, very soon play you something. So, Resemblance is the name of the album. I have a copy somewhere, which I will leave behind for this university. So, Resemblance is the name of the album. And it's a collaboration between Indian, primarily Hindustani style, as North Indian style musicians, and Chinese musicians who are vocalists as well as instrumentalists, and a canto-pop lyricist who also joined us. So those of you who don't know Hindustani, so Sat Sat is a Hindi word which means together, together. And it's an intentional repetition of a word which you find very commonly in the Chinese languages as well, and you do it to show its importance. And we're echoing how it might be said in Mandarin or Cantonese. So our double album, which you will find on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, etc., and I urge you to look for it, is a result of multiple crisscrossing journeys. So it was a lot of travel in order to make the connection possible. It brought Chinese musicians to Bangalore and Mumbai in India. It took Indian musicians to Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, Hangzhou, Suzhou, and Wuhan. And through the shared language of music, Resemblance, Sat Sat opens up, I think, new possibilities for inter-Asian conversations. So the album's main title, Resemblance, refers to the seeking of similarity in difference. Zhang Yi, the pipa player, you will see him soon, creates a melody that resembles a Hindustani raga, but at the same time is not that raga. When the Indian singers vocalize Chow Yu-Fai's poem in Cantonese, perhaps it does not remain a Cantonese poem even when it resembles it. Perhaps it also resembles and reassembles a Hindustani raga. Historically, the musical crossings date back to the 6th and 7th centuries, a good 1,500 years ago, during the Tang Dynasty in China, when songs, instruments, and musicians from West Asia and South Asia thronged the port cities of China. Taizong, the second Tang emperor, one of the most celebrated emperors of China, was actually 3 parts of Shanbian nomadic origin from the so-called Western regions and 1 part Han Chinese. It's during the Tang Dynasty that the prevailing musical scale in China, it is believed, was transformed into the heptatonic scale under the influence of Indian or South Asian music. Musicologists are of the opinion that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the huge impact of Occidental music, Western music, in Republican China once again changed the course of Chinese music, bringing in harmony, for example. The old 7-note Indian scale also receded. But perhaps the latent memory of that old interaction still persists, manifested in the shape and sound of certain Chinese instruments, or in the ways Indian melodic structures can be harmonized with Chinese melodic expression. So, without holding on to the suspense any longer, I will just play you the first song. It's called The Wandering Cat. The first one. Sorry, can someone help? Yeah, I can hear you. Needs to be much louder. Is that good? I wanted to play you another one, but I realize as always that one runs out of time. As since it's available on Spotify and YouTube, I urge you to go look for the album and listen to all the songs. The Mandarin collaborations are very different from the Cantonese ones. The Cantonese ones are based on the poetry of Chow Yun-fai, who's also a board member of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. That's incidental. I think that, no, I'm not going to show this. I'm going to show the film, Movement Traces, just for a couple of minutes. Yeah, let's just watch this for a few minutes and then I'll speak about this project. Okay, while they sort that out, let me say a little more. That what happened in this particular track that you just heard is that the melody is in the sort of based on the rag bhairav of Hindustani music. It is actually composed by Jangi, the pipa player. He composed the melody. He asked the Indians to write the words of the song. So we collectively, 5 of us wrote the words for that. Then we translated the words into Mandarin, which is why you get this sense of movement back and forth between language and melody in this particular track. Each track had a different set of experiments around it. This is how this one worked. I know I don't have time to play you the Cantonese, but I'll just give you an idea of how the Cantonese collaborations worked. We did it in different ways. Any Hong Kongers speaking Cantonese here? Only one? Okay. Where are the Hong Kongers in this summer school? Unusual. Anyway. So Chaucy knows how the Cantonese collaborations work. But I'll just tell you very briefly. In the first instance, Chow Yun-fai sent the lyrics of a poem that he had written and spoke it so that people could hear what it sounded like. The Indian musicians composed that poem to Indian melodies and then sang it in a concert in Hong Kong and elsewhere. The second time around, they sent melodies in different ragas to Yufai. This was really challenging. And Chow Yun-fai then wrote poems responding to those melodies. So in doing that, and as you probably know, Cantonese has 9 inflections. It's a very inflectioned language. The intonation determines what the meaning is. So he was actually being challenged by the Hindustani melody to come up with new ways of, new words, really, in the Cantonese language. If you don't know Cantonese and Mandarin, this will not make any sense to you. But trust me, it works. And do listen to Chow Yun-fai's poetry. So that was a very fascinating exercise. When he was composing to Indian melodies, Indian musicians were composing their melodies to his poetry in Cantonese. And then Indian musicians were singing in Cantonese without knowing a word of the language. That is really something that you have to listen to. None of my Cantonese speaking friends figured out that the Indian musicians did not know Cantonese. Yeah. If you have a good ear, you can reproduce anything. What's happening here? So this is a film directed by Surbhi Sharma. It's based on my practice-based research. And I will just play you, it's not yet in the public domain, but I have a link. It should be out on Vimeo soon. Can we go slow? Is it moving? What's happening? You need this louder.
Perfect. Perfect.
I think it's Can you have the lights, please? It's a long film, and I just thought I should show you a couple of minutes to give you a sense of the interaction between the musicians. So from the experiments that I've been talking about, it should be clear that what was being questioned in each musical crossing was any simple characterization of a national essence or a civilizational essence. None of the musicians said, this is Indian music or this is Chinese music, and I won't be able to change my mode of musical expression. None of them said that. They all extended themselves in different ways, singing in a language they did not know, playing a note they did not know, not taking recourse to any argument about my tradition. Yeah, classical musicians are prone to saying this. This is my tradition and I will not sing anything else. None of them was doing that. So whether in the practice of satsang or in the framing of the project, we had to constantly struggle against methodological nationalism. It's a point I made earlier. This kind of nationalism is particularly evident in the formulation of questions about polity, economy, society, or culture in Asia. The big political project of the 20th century, which is decolonization, was premised on the idea of the nation, is what I said at the beginning, and of the nation state as being the vehicle for the realization of social political aspirations of the newly emerging public. But very often the nation state idea overdetermines both our institutional and epistemological endeavors. Research problems are formulated along national lines, and cultural practice also formulated along national lines, and the analyses as well as the solutions then restrict themselves to national boundaries. So when tracing the histories of the present, not all scholars grasp the interconnections between peoples, communities, and geographies that precede and continue to impact the contemporary world. I won't even go into international relations and strategic studies because they have an idea of national self-interest that doesn't allow them to see these larger connections. Even when thinking regionally, conventional combinations drawn from old colonial forms of governance, South Asia, East Asia, West Asia, Central Asia, etc., come into play. resulting in the continued use of 20th century Cold War perspectives. So we have been trying in the Inter-Asia network to, as Wan Xing Chen said, de-Cold War ourselves, with some success, I imagine. And that's also a way of challenging methodological nationalism. So what does it mean then to think about interconnections in Asia that don't fall into these colonial frameworks or into Cold War geopolitics? And I'm suggesting here, especially in this project, that we are connected but not the same. This is not a simple-minded globalization where the world becomes flat and everyone looks like everyone else, or every music is like every other music. What we're trying to do here in this practice-based project is to surface the histories of interconnection, to try and drill into the past of this connection and to see how that might impact the present as well. So I'm proposing 3 strategies for doing this. That one, we articulate what Mizoguchi called the base entity. There's a reference to that in the reading that you've done for the first lecture. We articulate the base entity by another word for base entities in deep history of each location we're describing as part of the modes of connection. B, we re-articulate historical connections which have been made invisible by the modern nation state. And C, we engage in anti-Orientalism. I imagine that all of you are doing a PhD, you have read Edward Said, you know what is Orientalism, etc. And to engage in anti-Orientalism might often mean to read Orientalist texts against the grain. So the first of them, the articulating the base entity, I've been doing in India in terms of my own work of the last 3 decades. And I've been attempting to understand the base entity in China through the secondary literature. Re-articulating historical connections, not many people are doing that kind of work, but there is some amazing scholarship. I only know the English language scholarship, which is from India, and I'm sure there is work in Mandarin as well, that I've begun to piece the re-articulated histories together with the help of Romila Thapar, Tan Sen Sen, and Madhavi Thampi, these 3 other ones who have influenced me the most in recent years. The third, the reading text against the Orientalist grain, is something that is a really important task, and very often we have to do that in the realm of popular culture. But that's where our deepest Orientalist imaginations lie. And I think that first we need to prepare a typology of these popular cultural artifacts. I've just begun to do that, and I can play you one example. I think that you'll see how, again, there is a sense of a popular cultural Inter-Asia that is being played out in this example. I'll play the song. Yeah. Hello. This is from a 1958 Hindi film called Howrah Bridge. And it's like a noir film. It's there's like a murder, there's a mystery, there's whatever. And the dancer is actually from Myanmar. And she settled in India later. So there's a whole sense of, that she's from China, her gestures are from Shanghai, and her spirit is from Singapore. So in a sense, these are what you see in Howrah Bridge is a sense of a liminal zone of engagement. Calcutta, where the film is set, is in eastern India, and from Calcutta to Kunming in China is barely an hour and a half, an hour if you fly. It's a completely different geography, a completely different location, and there is a way by which those connections have been alive and active for nearly 2,000 years. So when we look at the present-day opacities between India and China and the casual adoption of terms like the bamboo curtain, it's hard to imagine that there's actually been, well before the 20th century, 2,000 years of continuous engagement between the regions. There were mountain routes, there were desert routes, there were forest and sea routes, and they were all extremely difficult. We know about the famous monks from China who came to look for Buddhist relics and scriptures in India. The routes passed through Central Asia, through the desert, through the mountains, and the other route was from Yunnan, from northeastern India. And the sea routes were subsequently, which became more popular, were via Sri Lanka and Java. So I'm going to wind up this part of it. I took far more time than I imagined. This always happens when you're watching stuff. So my work on Hindustani music in Mumbai, which was my last book, had thrown up a number of questions about the formation of musical subjects, about the performance of modernity, about colonialism and cultural practice. So when I brought these questions to China via Hong Kong, where I worked for some years, the major challenge I faced was the existence of multiple forms of Orientalist knowledge, which I mentioned earlier made the Asian neighbors opaque to one another in the present. So you can't say we were simply going to recover the old history. That's not possible. That's not a viable political project or a cultural project. So we chose another method in the Saath Saath initiative. We embarked on a mode of musical conversation as a cultural political intervention. So we can't directly counter the Orientalist knowledge forms, but we are building arcs of connection, is a phrase I used earlier, through melody and through gesture, through eating and drinking together, through being on the road together. So the simple everyday gestures of eating, drinking, singing, traveling constitute the intervention that I spoke about that aims to create subtle cultural shifts that are not state-centered. You can't measure or assess these shifts, but you can still perceive them as when you play these kinds of music or you hear people playing this kind of music. So just quickly run through this so that, it's just some pictures from our project. We can get out of this one. Okay, I'll now jump to my second example, which is a multi-sited ethnographic research. This is called the Digital Intimacy Project. Can I have the... Yeah, you can do this one. So let me do an overall introduction very briefly. So what I've done, or actually this is a project I've undertaken with 9 other people. One of them has been with you, Chow Kam Singh, Tina, who unfortunately had to leave due to a family emergency. And I'm really sorry never to have met her. True to the name of the project, which is on digital intimacy, Tina and I will forever be digitally intimate because we've never met in person, only on Zoom. So what we do is we put forward the hypothesis in our project that the way in which young women understand and experience intimacy in the age of social media is qualitatively different from before the millennial turn and the expansion of digital technologies. So we understand intimacy to be closeness, familiarity, and attachment across a spectrum of relationships, including the familial, the peer-based, and the sexual. So while these realms of self-fashioning have been undergoing radical change since the emergence of modernity within non-Western context, the rapid expansion of digital technologies in the context of neoliberal transformations creates new conditions under which the public and private and ideas of tradition and modernity are negotiated. Experiences of young women have taken center stage in a growing literature that aims to highlight the complexities of social transformation in the 21st century. By focusing on young women's engagements with digital technology, we want to shed light on the interplay of gender, culture, and technology for experiences of rapid social change in each of these sites. So our sites are Guangzhou in China, Singapore, Bangalore in India, and Hong Kong. So we have 4 Asian cities that we have been looking at. This project is already now 5 or 6 years old, and some initial findings were presented actually in the Philippines, first of all, in 2019 before the pandemic in our Inter-Asia conference in Dumaguete. So I will not talk about those findings. I have a few slides on that if anyone's interested and questions come up. But I want to present some newer work here, which is the question of the intimacies of gendered modernities. This is an example of how we do historical research that is inter-Asian. Yeah? So this is the background. The immediate context is that the exponential growth of digital connectivity in Asia indicates that Asia now hosts more than half of the world's online population of 4.6 billion. And 50% of this is like women, are women. In Asia, 71.7% of youth aged 15 to 24 are on the internet. And most people in Asia access the internet through mobile phones. Connecting to other people primarily through the mediation of the internet has produced a range of cultural phenomena. But there's a tendency, whether in Inter-Asia or elsewhere, to talk about this as something that is happening everywhere and happening in identical ways or in the same way. So I'm going to try and mediate that particular argument a little bit. So while digital mediation is an important new context for understanding gender and sexuality, we must remember that this context is undergirded by longer histories of social change, which is what I'll be speaking about. And these longer histories unfurled as societies all over the world became modern from the 19th century onwards. While this was a worldwide process, the specific dynamics of modernity within Asian context are to be noted. And these dynamics are both similar and different across Guangzhou, Bangalore, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Drawing out trajectories of modernity and the constitutive role of gender and sexuality in their formations is crucial for understanding the contemporary transformations that continue to shape and reshape these locations. So broadly, I'm sure this has come up, but just so that we are all on the same page, let me say by modernity, we refer to the multi-layered transformations in public life and personal subjecthood wrought by large historical forces such as capitalism and colonialism, as shown in phenomena such as the rise of mass transport, new forms of urbanization. Can I go to the next slide? Yeah, I think I already went through this. Next, please. Yeah, you can hold it here. Yeah, just to backtrack a little. So I think that we have talked about how these circuits intersect with the local histories of the region, although they might seem similar. And the idea of creating alternative frames of reference, which has informed Inter-Asia cultural studies and my own engagement with the research in this region, is a very important part of how we think about this project. Next, please. Yeah, I'll come back to the modernity thing in a minute, but I just want you to go through this. We were 10 people, and you see that. We were 10-member research team spread across these 4 locations. Most of us have met each other except for Tina. We did 30 to 40 interviews in each location, and some of the interviews were during the pandemic. I had done some earlier in Guangzhou, Hong Kong. So because we were forced to finish conducting interviews, many of them were done online, especially in Singapore and Guangzhou subsequently. So there is a kind of pandemic ethnography that we have not have factored into how we did our project, and it's not comparable across sites, but we are struggling with that. And the interviews were conducted by all of us in the group, 10 members. We examined the usual documents, media reports, etc. but the ethnography is really the basis of our findings. Next, please. Yeah, I come to this, but let me just talk about the modernity thing. So modernity is demonstrated in phenomena such as the rise of mass transport, new forms of urbanization, communication, new modes of governance, and the emergence of bureaucracy. So these forces have had a worldwide impact, even if societies around the world mediated the effects in different ways, given their specific histories, leading to different kinds of subject formation. Drawing on the insights of post-colonial studies, we assert that modernity within non-Western contexts has very specific dynamics, whether the society has been formally colonized or not. The entangled processes of what came to be called modernization and westernization generated social transformations within societies of the non-West, through which new and specific forms of modernity emerged, tied very often to the emergence of modern post-colonial nations. So this brings us to what I have called and other scholars have called the national modern, that the emergence of the national modern thus becomes a crucial context for understanding contemporary transformations in these societies. This is something I've already touched upon. Then when you have the digital apps and platforms, it seems to suggest that we all inhabit the cyber domain in similar ways. But we argue that, and there could be significant local variance because the material conditions of these locations are quite different. And the diverse local histories translate into contemporary digital habits. The conditions of access are different in each place. There are firewalls in China. There are other forms of shutdowns in India. There are other questions in Singapore, etc. And we have different trajectories of how internet culture developed in all of these places as well, which we talk about at great length in the city chapters of our book. The book, by the way, is nearly ready. We have over 200 pages, and we hope for it to be published by next year. The languages we use online, that's also very fascinating. I won't be going into that today, but if you have any questions, I can talk a little bit more about that. Yeah. So because of all these factors, we argue that in each location, the manifestation of digital cultures is somewhat different. So this talk, however, is not about those phenomena, but about the longer histories of social change that make each location what it is. So I won't only dip into each location and talk about the history of that location. I'll demonstrate, I hope, how you can move from one history to another and how they're interconnected. Is there a time limit? Until 12. No, so I'll try and wind this up in maybe less than half an hour, so we have time to discuss. Historians of gender and empire have shown that a key justification for colonial rule, and within discourses and projects of westernization more generally, was a civilizing mission. And the civilizing mission is very often manifested in the reforming of practices to do with women. Yeah, that saving downtrodden women from the colonies was an important way in which imperial ideologies functioned across the non-Western world. So meeting the challenges posed by such criticisms, very often the elites in each space took up the task of social transformation, and they called that social reform. Central to this historical dynamic across our four contexts was the woman question. Scholarship on social reform and emergent national consciousness in the 19th century point to the ways in which male reformers hinged their efforts at modernization or the defense of tradition on the treatment of women, articulating ideas about women's nature, their capacities, and their rights and wrongs. This, of course, mirrored the ways that the treatment of women became a key justification for the civilizing mission of imperial rule. So there are two areas that stand out in these debates. One, debates about the eradication of practices understood as traditional, whether this had to do with caste hierarchies or widow remarriage in India, or foot binding and divorce for women in China, to take just a few examples. In the universalist and humanist imagination prevailing in colonial or semi-colonial societies from the late 19th century onwards, these traditional practices prevented the societies from being seen as humane and civilized, therefore Western, right? So you had to do away with the practices in order to make these societies civilized. Initially, this was seen as a reform process, But in China, for example, the process was eventually framed as a revolutionary process. And the social transformation that we saw there marked a distinct rupture with the past. In yet other societies like India or the subcontinent more broadly, it is understood as reform rather than rupture, laying the groundwork for anti-colonial nationalist definitions of a modern national identity as a space of national sovereignty that needed to be asserted against colonial rule. Within the Indian context, debates about the eradication of practices such as widow remarriage, child marriage, matrilineal forms of kinship and inheritance, and widow immolation or sati in upper caste Hindu context was one vector. So these are all seen as, bad practices that need to be eradicated. This is one vector for moving from what was considered traditional to what was considered modern. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit here. This is whether it was Hindu or Muslim in the subcontinent. Similar questions were raised in relation to so-called traditional practices. A second key set of debates was about the desire, possibility, and nature of women's entry into modern publics through education, labor, and emerging spaces of consumption in modernizing cities. An emergent modern middle class, sometimes tied to assertive national movements, redefined normative middle class femininity as a site of a modern national culture that is simultaneously traditional and modern. Such discourses and projects led to the spread of Western style education for women and girls, the opening up of new forms of work for women, new practices of consumption, all simultaneous with shifting family formations and refashioned ideas of home and domesticity. These debates about ideas of tradition and modernity point to the centrality of culture, to the politics of refashioning subjectivity and modernity in the colonial as well as post-colonial context, and gives us a clue as to why women, gender and sexuality occupy such a central place in discussions about culture in Asia. So debates about culture are an intimate part of the formation of nationalist modernity in Asian context, even as culture is pitted against modernity. Why is that? We can talk about that later, but culture is something that is seen as Asian and modernity that which is Western. So the figure of woman, in its alignment with culture in China as in India, thus appears at a strange intersection. This is the locus where a traditionalist basis for national identity, that a woman is often associated with national identity, intersects with the idea of women's emancipation as a harbinger of modernity. Yeah, you see the contradictions here, and we can talk a little bit more about that. In China, a critique of feudalism began to take shape from the late 19th century onwards and found political articulation in the May 4th movement that began in 1919. The reformist Kuomintang party led by Sun Yat-sen was formed in Guangzhou, which is one of our sites, which as an outward-facing southern Chinese city had since the 17th century been in the vanguard of economic and social developments that eventually affected the rest of the country. Just like in India, social reform around the women's question became the site of articulation of a new modernity. Although the question and the history of colonialism is not articulated in China because of its disavowal in Cold War-inspired area studies, I'm quoting Tani Barlow here, that you can't really talk about colonialism in China, but she says that that's because of the way in which Cold War studies has conceptualized China. But we can conceptualize a semi-colonialism, or perhaps what I might call a colonialism under erasure, as informing the fascination with Western modernity that greatly shaped both discursive structures in early 20th century China, as well as young women's actual lives. In fact, the social impetus to dismantle the legacy of the Qing dynasty drew on key ideas of Western modernity, among which were notions of modern women who had natural bodies and unbound feet. Like in the Indian nationalist discourse about women, class position and sexuality were important sites where debates about women were undertaken. Elite women were expected to acquire enough modern education to engage creditably in the activity of social reproduction, but not so much that they became like Ibsen's Nora. Ibsen, the playwright, had a character called Nora who walked out of the house, right? They could not become like that. And this was a character much discussed in China at the time, that women should not become like Nora, and that they abandon their marital home and their domestic duties. Non-elite women, on the other hand, especially those who were young and single, who were moving in large numbers from the rural hinterland to urban areas like Guangzhou and Hong Kong to join the different service economy sectors that were opening up, these young women caused social anxiety and moral panic. through their mobility and hypervisibility in the cities. The anxiety was tied to the sexual freedoms enjoyed by young unmarried women who were living by themselves away from their families. The association of such freedoms with the class position of the women resonates with similar debates in India at a slightly earlier time. With pressure from Japanese militarism and the concessions extracted by Western powers after the Opium Wars, in Republican China, which is 1911 to 1949, in Republican China there was an imagining of the bound woman as representing an enslaved and unemancipated nation. We make the connection between woman and nation here. I'm quoting the brilliant work of Angelina Chin, who's written about these questions. Although women began to benefit from increased mobility through education and employment, social regulations put in place by the state and the party sought to control their access to both kinds of opportunities. Women were becoming part of modern publics in a significant way in Guangzhou. As service workers in a range of sites, from restaurants to tea houses to department stores, women helped to create new conventions of heterosexual intimacy, quoting Angelina Chin. In these public occupations, they were performing what could be called the public work of intimacy. It's a very interesting and important argument here. Part of the China narrative reflected the shape of women's lives in Hong Kong as well, as did the opportunities and restrictions produced by British colonialism. Hong Kong is only 100 miles away from Guangzhou, and the two cities have been historically well connected by train, road, and sea. From the end of the First Opium War, when it was ceded by the Qing Emperor to the British in 1842, and all the way up to 1997, Hong Kong was a British colony, with a governance apparatus controlled by the British and with limited participation by the Chinese merchant elite, a situation named as collaborative colonialism by my former colleague, the cultural studies scholar Lau Ying Sang. Hong Kong too received thousands of single young women in the early 20th century looking for employment. Women engaged in publicly intimate work such as prostitutes were prominent in the landscape of this free port that became a transit point for sailors from all over the world. But the female figure that received the most attention from the British administrators, Christian missionaries, and the Chinese elite was the figure of the Mui Chai, a bondmaid who would be sold by her parents while still a child to a wealthy Chinese family in Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, we see the playing out of tradition and modernity on the body of this abject female figure. Under colonial rule, the practice of Mui Chai was a social reform issue, the resolution of which tried to maintain a balance between British interests informed by Christianity and the cultural sentiments of the Chinese merchant elite. Apart from those women in situations of bonded labor, there were those who took advantage of the soft border between southern China and the British colony, which allowed migration and remigration in a circulatory fashion, especially in the early 20th century. After the major labor strike, referred to as the Guangzhou-Hong Kong strike in 1925, many women moved back and forth between the two cities depending on the availability of work. Like in Guangzhou, working-class Chinese women in Hong Kong entered a range of occupations in the service sector and in the industrial sector, including sex work. Issues of sexuality and sex work were dealt with in specific ways by the British administration. I quote here the work of film and culture studies scholar Yao Ching, who talks about how the different programs of Western colonial modernities, through legal reform, public health, and spatial management, try to control the way in which these women occupied public space. Yao Ching reminds us that from the time Hong Kong became a colony, men outnumbered the women by far, whether it was Europeans who had come as part of the navy, army, or merchant ships, or Chinese men who had left their families behind in southern China. The pleasure industries were thus central to the city's economy. And I quote, during 1905 to 1935, it was reported that half of all tax revenue came from the sex industry. This industry was regulated by a series of British measures, including the Contagious Diseases Ordinance. Sorry, I forgot all about my PPT, but let me run you through it in a minute. Yeah, I can leave this with you all if you want to refer back to it later. Yeah, Christine can circulate it. I already talked about this, not so fast. I've discussed this question of the alignment of woman with the question of national identity in China as in India. Next, please. So this is where I am actually, the question of the expanding publics and the place of women in these publics. And here I do add the comparison. that in India, sorry, I'm coming to this in a minute. I'm still in the colonial period. Yao-Ching argues that prostitution should be seen as one of the keys to Hong Kong modernity. I find this a very startling and interesting argument. So she says, after prostitution was banned in Hong Kong in 1932, a large number of dance academies, bathhouses, massage parlors, gentlemen's clubs, tourist agencies, flower margins, drinking houses, girls' tea stands, and other pleasure sites proliferated. Professions of public women further diversified into boat rowers, dance hostesses, and socialites, sing-song girls, blind songstresses, wine house and tea house waitresses, call girls, escorts and guides, bar girls, beauticians, masseuses, and sellers at street stalls. And she talks about evidence from film, from fiction, from all of these to make this argument. This is really a proliferation of occupations, right? And she sees all of them as having come from the former prostitution industry sector. Just as in Guangzhou, although under a different regulatory regime that was colonial in nature, service sector women in Hong Kong were engaged in the public work of intimacy. Yeah? I have something to say about Bangalore, which will be there's no one here. Anyone from India here? Only one person? Anyway, this may not be familiar to you if you're not from southern India or from Bangalore. This is my hometown. So Bangalore was under indirect colonial rule. It was not directly ruled by the British, but the British controlled the king of Mysore, who was, and they also set up a cantonment or an army outpost, a very large one in Bangalore city. So part of Bangalore was colonial and the other part was for the natives. So it used to be a military and trading outpost of the former Vijayanagar Empire in pre-colonial times, and by the 19th and 20th centuries, it became a major cantonment city of the British, the largest in South India. The city was bifurcated, and this actually has an impact on how we carried out our study, because these bifurcations still exist, into local Kannada-speaking population and areas that cater to the British and non-Kannada-speaking communities. You may not even know the languages, they're largely Tamil-speaking and other languages. So what used to be a city of palaces, tanks, parks, temples, mosques and markets became intertwined with English-style parks, cathedrals, government buildings, English-style schools, colleges and hospitals, and boulevards. Like in Hong Kong, in Bangalore too, you had the 1864 Contagious Diseases Prevention Act, aimed at protecting British Army soldiers from local prostitutes. And this actually provided the template for the Hong Kong Ordinance mentioned already. I'm not going to come to the post-1950s, just hold on to this slide until I tell you, Christine. So I'm going to talk about some of this material here. Emerging from the era of formal European empires and into post-coloniality, the contours of the non-Western world are shaped by the consolidations of nation-state formation. This, of course, is happening in China and in India, and the situation in Hong Kong and Singapore is somewhat different, which I'll talk about. So within this context, the gender, culture, modernity nexus continues to mediate social change, albeit in different ways, as state developmentalist agendas emerge in the post-war context. The transformations of Bangalore, Guangzhou, Singapore and Hong Kong in the second half of the 20th century are complexly interwoven with the national modern in the case of Bangalore and Guangzhou, and to the transformations of port cities into city-states or special territories like in Singapore and Hong Kong. In the post-independence period in India, the emerging national development state shaped by the broadly national socialist vision of India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, transformed Bangalore into a city of manufacturing beyond the dominance of the textile industry, supported by an expanding network of education in the areas of science, technology and engineering, which is why today it's the IT city of India. Yeah? The developmental state in India optimistically invested in science, technology and industrialization through a variety of public sector enterprises to meet the challenges of mass poverty both within urban and rural contexts. So the manufacturing and educational infrastructure of Bangalore created new opportunities for women and girls to enter the realms of modern education, especially higher education and modern spaces of work. So these young women who entered the public domain in Bangalore could be typical garment workers, or they could be employees of public sector units, and banks, or students in colleges and universities. They all hope for jobs in government, in medicine, in banking and other public sector institutions. As the city expanded, although there is a local language that became, pretty much in the minority as the second half of the 20th century proceeds, local Kannada-speaking inhabitants mediated the presence of migrants from other parts of India through the complexities of an emergent local or Kannada nationalism. The expansion of education and work needs to be contextualized within a broader vision of gender development in India. So it's not totally different from what's happening in the rest of India, but it has its own specificities. Curiously, India has one of the lowest rates of participation of women within the formal economy, but that's a different story and we can't go into that now. In China, in the second half of the 20th century, so you've seen this, right? Can you see the next one, please? Okay, I haven't come there yet. Can we go back to the previous one? So in China, in the second half of the 20th century, state socialism and post-socialism disentangled women from a symbolic economy that had placed them under the sign of culture and tradition, which was in the past, right? The Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976 with the death of Chairman Mao, led to other disruptions in young women's lives, especially those who had earlier benefited from class mobility. Subsequently, the period of economic reforms inaugurated by Deng Xiaoping in 1978 and China's gradual entry into the global marketplace have afforded young women new subject positions, especially those women who migrated to industrial hubs such as Guangzhou and Shenzhen from thousands of miles away. So more than 40% of China's labor force consists of migrants, temporary or permanent. Education was seen as one of the pillars of the four modernizations announced in the post-Mao period in 1977, and about 90% of Chinese people, one of the highest figures in the world, have 9 years of compulsory education. So building on the equalizing of educational opportunities gestured towards in the earlier Great Leap Forward period in the 1950s and the socialist education movement of the early 1960s, attempting to redress the problems of the lost years of the Cultural Revolution, post-reform China opened up more university places and increased the number by giving permission for private universities to establish themselves. So as some of you might know, if you are coming from China, only 5% of all students wanting to enter university can be accommodated within the Chinese university system, which is why you have such a large number of Chinese students going outside to study. There's an examination called the Gaokao, which did bring 44 million students into higher education, but and also the mismatch between the qualifications you gain in university and the employment opportunities that you find. So whoever can afford it can, even if they sell things or mortgage property, try to find education outside the country. There's a very interesting book that some of you may know about called Harvard Girl. Anyone heard of this? Yeah, you have. So it's the story of Liu Yiting, who from the age of 15 days old was trained by her family to become someone who migrated abroad and sought higher education at 15 days old. It's fascinating to see what all they exposed her to. She eventually studied economics and mathematics in the US, and her story has been a bestseller in China. So I'm sort of winding down the story now. After the establishment of the communist-led PRC in the People's Republic of China in 1949, Hong Kong's border became less elastic. But working-class women from southern China continued to find their way into Hong Kong to take up menial jobs that paid too little by local standards. Decades of industrial production in Hong Kong, primarily in textiles, garments, toys, and electronics, spurred on by the mainland Chinese entrepreneurs who relocated to the British colony during the Civil War and after the establishment of the PRC, led to the entry of more women into industrial work. Although the large majority of women in public appeared to be part of the pleasure industries well into the 1960s, with substantial numbers of textile factory workers until the 1980s, there was also the growing visibility of middle-class women, educated in English medium and bilingual secondary and tertiary institutions in the bureaucracy, the banking sector, education, and the judiciary. Free and compulsory education in Hong Kong through the 20th century in the government-run schools ensured a high level of literacy. So today 65% of adult women in Hong Kong are employed. And the white-collar workers among them are supported by cheap foreign domestic labor from the Philippines and Indonesia, who look after child rearing and the domestic sphere. Emerging as a port city of the British Empire, Singapore became an important and strategic crossroads of trade, migration, the Chinese, Malay and Indian migration, economic and military flows within the Southeast Asian region. Female migration to this port city was intertwined in important ways with a sexual economy linked to prostitution, a brothel system, and all the attendant processes of regulation, patriarchy, and protectionism that emerged to the civilizing discourses of missionaries and social reformers. After incorporation into and then expulsion from a Malaysian federation, Singapore's post-war independence trajectory also involved an aggressive drive towards development and modernization as a city-state while forging a new kind of national consciousness. However, rather than adopting an import substitution model tied to a national socialist vision, Singapore opened itself up to the world capitalist economy under the dominant leadership of its first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew through industrialization, entrepreneurship and banking, with important constraints placed on media and politics within the country. So becoming an Asian tiger by the 1980s through capitalist modernization, investments in housing, education and health that encompass the majority of the population, you have what's called a capitalist nanny state. It's a welfare state, but it's a capitalist state. Yeah? And an effort is to manage the multicultural ethno-racial divisions between the Malay, Chinese and Indian populations that comprise the city-state's nationalist project. Since Singapore's educational system is touted as a model, or those of you from NES will know this, for generating students who are highly competitive for achievements in math and science, and the state then invests in the key institutions of the family, this is the fulcrum of that buttresses the welfare state across ethno-racial communities, invoking neo-Confucian Asian values to marry the nanny state to both political authoritarianism and conservative and protectionist discourses of gender and sexuality. So I now come to the, can I have the next slide? To try and wrap up some of this and try to bring us into the present. By the end of the 1980s, we come to the period of economic reforms and neoliberalism in all of our sites. So through various policies of structural adjustment and the dismantling of economic boundaries to ease the free flow of capital, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the rise of neoliberal transformations of capital and geopolitics, in this context, Bangalore, Singapore, Hong Kong and Guangzhou transformed themselves yet again. As studies of neoliberalism have shown, these large-scale economic and political transformations are complexly interrelated to the conditions under which self and subjectivity are negotiated, with important implications for refashionings of gender and sexuality. So we're trying to bring together a question of the large political and social transformations, economic transformations, with the question of subjectivity, especially as manifested through digital intimacy. Yeah? That's where we conclude this particular framing chapter, which I won't have time to go into right now. So by the late 1980s, the economic liberalization of the Indian economy greatly impacted Bangalore, which became a key site for its embodiment. Dubbed the Silicon Valley of India, Bangalore turned into a central node for India's information technology industry, building on the science, technology and educational infrastructure that scaffolds the rapid expansion of this industry. The broader transformations of economy, culture and politics that marked liberalization in India fundamentally altered the city as an explosion of technology parks, high-rise apartment buildings, malls, highways and metro systems added another layer to the urban transformations of the city. Today, Bangalore is the fastest growing metro area in the Asia-Pacific region, having increased its population by 70% over the last 2 decades as it aspires to the status of a global city. As I have argued, and as Reggie Lucas, my collaborator who co-wrote this with me, and Nitya Vasudevan, we've all argued that the liberalization of the Indian economy has fueled a cultural politics of globalization, in and through which the earlier nexus of gender, culture, modernity mediates anxieties about rapid social change and transformation. Anxieties about globalization surface in highly gendered politics about the place of women in public and the spectre of sexual exploitation in an ever-expanding commodity culture. From the 1990s onwards, the prevalence and persistence of moral panics from both an ascendant right-wing Hindu nationalist movement and from the liberal left, coincidentally. This moral panic about beauty pageants, fashion shows, celebration of Valentine's Day amongst young people suggests the ambivalent and contested nature of young women's opportunities in globalized India. Such objections to liberalization reveal how celebrations of liberalization's promises provoke anxious discourses and regulations of young women, their bodies, their sexuality, and their vulnerability. Nowhere is this more evident than in and around Bangalore. Bangalore has really become a flashpoint, if you like. There were clashes against the staging of the Miss World Beauty pageant in 1996. There was a Pink Chaddi internet campaign after a pub attack in 2009 where young college girls who were in a pub drinking in the afternoon were beaten up and thrown out of the pub. And there was a campaign led by young women against these attacks. And Bangalore, therefore, has been a crucial site for mediating the cultural politics of women, gender, and sexuality in liberalized India. These spectacular instances of reaction and moral panic go alongside the politics of gender and sexuality that must be negotiated by young women as they navigate new forms of youthful gendered labor in call centers, spaces of consumption such as cafes, pubs, and malls, the street, educational spaces, and the like. The remaking of the self as an aspiring individual, which is a key premise of neoliberalism, the remaking of the self as an aspiring individual was promoted by a number of programs launched by workplaces in romantic fiction, TV drama, and also in the popular discourses of consumerism and pop psychology. This is in China. These are all now beamed from digital platforms and available on the mobile phone. In the reform period in China, the notion of women was re-rooted in biology, and female workers were urged to make place for men by exiting the workplace and taking up unpaid domestic labor. However, the 1980s was also the time when the state promoted industrial production and tacitly encouraged the mass migration from rural areas to the factories in southern and eastern China. The re-feminization of women, including the migrant women in post-socialist China, converges with the proliferation of new objects of consumption. The mobile phone became a significant feature of the migrant's life, although SIM cards and identities changed constantly as women moved from one factory job to another. Our Guangzhou interviewees, who are of course college students and not factory workers, barely remember a time when they did not have mobile phones, whether they're city bred or from a small town, even if some of their earliest intimate internet exchanges were on message boards and chat rooms. Although internet services have been available since the late 1980s in China, digital citizenship became a key feature of Chinese society only from 2009, with the launch of the microblogging platform Weibo and the availability of cheap mobile phones from about that time. Global platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are blocked in China, but can be accessed through illegal VPN services, as many of you would know. Nearly 74% of the population in China, or 1.05 billion people, use the internet, mostly through mobile phones like in India. I'll finish in 5 minutes. The ubiquity of digital technology in contemporary China, whether related to sending and receiving money, surveillance, public participation, or relationships, deeply informs the choices young women make with regard to articulating and representing their closeness to others. This digital ubiquity is widespread across the region and in the 4 cities that we are researching. Singapore's experience of neoliberalism is not the kind of radical break from prior forms and imaginations of nationalist development as in India or even in China. Given its path of full incorporation into the global capitalist economy tied to a top-down welfare state, neoliberalism in Singapore must be understood as an intensification of existing tendencies and contradictions. Unlike the standard accounts of neoliberalism that paint a state in retreat and withdrawal, the state in Singapore has intensified its interventionist policies in pro-family housing and natalist policies to stem the trend of low fertility and later marriage, which is common within the region more generally, while emphasizing more than ever individual responsibility, competition, and meritocracy as the avenues for economic success. While these pro-family policies do not succeed as intended in terms of age of marriage or fertility rates, sociologists have argued that the discursive link between state and the patriarchal family conscripts individuals into a neoliberal morality that underpins the state-society relations in Singapore. Unlike in Bangalore in India or Guangzhou in China, where a period of inward-looking nationalist economic consolidation was followed in the 1980s and 90s by economic liberalization or reforms, Hong Kong stayed a British colony until 1997, stitched into the world economy via the United Kingdom and acclaimed by neoliberal economist Milton Friedman as the freest market in the world. Calibrating our framework for Hong Kong, we would need to understand that the neoliberal subject here has a genealogy inflected by extended colonialism, as well as a political and social antagonism with the mainland from which most Hong Kongers come. In a process that began in the 1970s and speeded by the economic reforms in China in the late 1980s, by the 1990s, 80% of Hong Kong factories were relocated to mainland China, mostly to the Pearl River Delta, to cities such as Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Dongguan. By the time of the handover of the colony to China in 1997, the local economy of Hong Kong was focused on the service sector, including tourism and retail trade, where many women found employment. The stronger push from China to realign Hong Kong with the mainland after the student-led protests of 2019 has brought a renewed attention to education. Administrators are engaged in curricular reform to weed out potentially critical perspectives, and how this overhaul of the education system impacts the everyday life and the intimacies of the college-going student is yet to be studied or understood. So my discussion, this is it, right? Yeah, that's the last slide, I think. So my discussion has demonstrated the ways in which our sites are located within the interlinked yet differentiated histories of colonialism, capitalism, modernity, nationalism, and the neoliberal present. So you had a quick tour of 200 years as they frame formations of gender, sexuality, and culture. The practices of digital intimacy that have emerged on these sites may appear to be superficially similar, but we contend that the difference can be perceived through the variously gendered histories of these locations. For the rest of it and the findings, you can look for the book next year.